In the quiet hours of the night, when the world outside falls silent, there are places where the darkness seems heavier, where the shadows stretch longer. It's in these places that the human mind wanders, often drifting into the unsettling. And what if, in those moments, the fears that have always lived in the corners of our minds were not merely stories passed down to keep us cautious, but something much more real? Think back to those fleeting moments of dread, the times you felt someone or something was watching you. You turned to check, convinced you'd seen nothing, and yet the sense remained, prickling at the back of your neck, a chill in the air, a soft creak from the floorboards. You tell yourself it's nothing, the wind perhaps, or the old house settling in. But what if it wasn't? It begins slowly, doesn't it? A faint sound carried on the wind, a whisper you can't quite make out, a figure glimpsed out of the corner of your eye, gone the moment you turn to look. These moments are easy to dismiss in the daylight, explained away by the rational mind. But what if, when the rain falls hardest, when the night is at its darkest, there really is something out there waiting? What if those instincts, the ones we've been told are nothing more than an overactive imagination, are right? What if the stories we've been told, meant to soothe us to sleep, were actually warnings, misunderstood and ignored? This is not the tale of an overactive mind or a superstition told for fun. This is a story rooted in something deeper, a truth that has been buried for generations. A truth that, once unearthed, changes everything. Imagine a place, far from the comfort of the familiar, where the night seems never-ending and the rain falls like an endless whisper from the heavens. In this place, generations have lived in uneasy quiet, going about their lives during the day, but come nightfall, things are different. Doors are locked early, curtains drawn tight. No one speaks of it openly, but everyone knows the night doesn't belong to them. In this small, forgotten town, tucked deep within the woods, there's an unspoken rule. Never go into the forest after dark. For years, outsiders have scoffed at the warnings, claiming the fears are nothing more than folklore. But those who call this place home know better. They've felt it. The weight of the air after sunset, the way the trees seem to shift and close in, how the rain, once soothing, feels like a shroud. Some say it all started decades ago, though no one can agree on the exact details. The stories vary, but they all share one common thread. It always happens during a storm. The rain comes heavier than usual. The sky darkens and something moves in the forest. It doesn't announce its presence with loud crashes or growls. It's quieter than that, more deliberate. It waits. It watches. For the townspeople, it's just part of life. Most of them keep their heads down, avoid the forest at night, and pretend the strange occurrences are just tricks of the mind. But sometimes, when the storms are especially fierce, people start to disappear. They vanish, without a trace, without a sound. And each time, there's always someone who remembers hearing footsteps just before the rain swallowed them. It's easy to dismiss, of course. Easy to say there's a logical explanation. But for those who've lived here long enough, they know better. They know that when the rain comes, when the thunder rolls through the trees, something else comes with it. Something that's been waiting patiently for its time to come again. But why does it happen? Why here? in this remote part of the world. The town has its theories, but no one dares to dig too deeply. It's said that long ago, something terrible happened in these woods. A group of settlers, desperate to claim the land, ignored the warnings of those who came before them. They thought they could control the land, bend it to their will. But they were wrong. The forest had its own rules, and they had broken them. The exact nature of their crime has been lost to time, but the punishment remains. The townspeople say that the forest is alive, that it remembers, and that every time the rain falls, it demands a toll. Some have tried to leave, but it's said that once you've seen the forest for what it truly is, it never lets you go. Now, the storm has returned. The rain, heavier than ever, beats down on the town, and the shadows move once again. In the coming hours, the night will reveal its secrets, and those who are brave or foolish enough to confront the darkness will learn the truth. But they may wish they hadn't. It's watching, waiting, and when the rain stops, it will be too late. The rain continues, soft at first, then heavier, like a heartbeat picking up pace. For those in the town, it's just another night. The sound of raindrops against rooftops has long been a part of life here. But beneath that familiar rhythm, there's an unease, a feeling that never quite goes away. It's subtle, creeping, like the fog that rolls in with each storm. And tonight, the rain has returned stronger than before. For newcomers, it's easy to dismiss the town's traditions. After all, what harm could there be in a walk through the woods? What danger could there possibly be in the sound of rain? But this place is different. The locals know it. The outsiders, they learn it. At the edge of town, there's a house, old, worn, with peeling paint and broken shutters. It's been there for as long as anyone can remember. Some say it was the first house built here, back when the settlers arrived. Others say it was never truly built at all, that it simply appeared one day, standing silently on the edge of the woods, waiting. Those who live near the house have heard things, strange things, the sounds of knocking late at night, but no one at the door. Whispered voices carried on the wind, too quiet to understand, but too persistent to ignore. They tell themselves it's just the wind. It has to be. But in the dead of night, when the rain is at its heaviest, doubts creep in. What if it's not just the wind? Inside the house, a family sits, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. They've lived here for years, always on the edge of leaving but never quite able to. Something keeps them here, something they can't explain. The father, once skeptical, now glances out the window at every gust of wind, every crack of thunder. The mother stays close to the children, her hands trembling when the night is at its darkest. And the children, well, they've seen things too. It was the youngest, their daughter, who first spoke of the figure in the woods. At first, they thought it was her imagination, a child's mind creating stories from shadows and trees. But then, things started happening. Things they couldn't explain. It began with small things. Objects moved from where they'd been left. Doors opening on their own. And always when the rain fell hardest, there was that feeling that they were not alone. The father tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was the storm, the wind, the old house settling. But deep down he knew something was wrong. And every time he looked out the window, every time the rain blurred his vision, he saw it, just at the edge of the trees. Watching, the figure never came close, not at first. It stayed just far enough away, always on the edge of his vision. But it was there, always. And as the nights grew longer, as the storms became more frequent, it started to move closer. Each night, a little nearer. Each night, its form becoming clearer, more distinct. The mother heard it next, the soft sound of footsteps outside their window, like someone or something pacing just beyond the door. She told herself it was nothing, just the rain, but as the nights passed, the footsteps grew louder, closer, and then one night she heard it. It was just after midnight, the storm at its peak, when the knock came, slow, steady. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the rain. Someone or something was outside their door. She froze, fear gripping her chest as she waited for the next sound. But there was nothing, just the rain tapping against the glass. The father, hearing the knock too, moved cautiously toward the door. His hand hovered over the knob, his breath shallow. He knew somehow that whoever or whatever was outside wasn't there to ask for shelter, and so he waited. He waited for it to leave, but the knock didn't stop. It continued, slow, deliberate, as if it knew the family was inside, terrified, huddled together in the dark. The father didn't open the door that night. He couldn't, and when the knocking finally stopped, replaced once more by the sound of the rain, he thought perhaps it was over. But the next morning, when the rain had stopped and the sky had cleared, he found them. Footprints, wet, muddy footprints, leading up to the door and then back into the woods. They were too large to be human, too heavy, and they stopped just at the edge of the trees, waiting. The family tried to continue their lives as before, but the knocking returned. Each time the rain fell, the figure came closer. Each time it stayed longer, and the whispers, once distant, grew louder. They could hear them now, faint, just beneath the sound of the storm. Words they couldn't understand but felt deep within them. The father knew they couldn't stay much longer. He began packing their things, preparing to leave. But something held him back. Every time he tried to leave, he felt it, an invisible pull, like the force itself was holding them here, trapping them. And then one night, it all changed. The storm was unlike any they'd seen before. The rain pounded against the windows, the wind howled, and the house creaked as if ready to collapse. And yet, through the noise, through the chaos, they heard it. It was not a warning this time. It was a demand. The figure was no longer waiting at the edge of the trees. It was here, at their door. What would happen if they opened it? The father, terrified but unable to resist, reached for the knob. His hand trembled as he turned it, the door creaking open. And as the rain poured down, as the storm raged outside, he saw it. But what he saw was something he could never have prepared for. The father stood frozen, the door creaking open in his hand. The storm raged around him, rain pelting the ground, the wind howling through the trees. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the next, as he squinted through the rain. At first, there was nothing, only darkness, only the storm, and then he saw it, a shape just beyond the trees, barely visible through the downpour. It wasn't human, that much he knew, but it wasn't an animal either. It stood there, unmoving, its form obscured by the rain and mist, as if it were part of the storm itself. His breath caught in his throat. He wanted to slam the door to hide, to pretend he hadn't seen anything. But something kept him rooted to the spot, unable to tear his eyes away. As he watched, the figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. It didn't walk like a man. Its movements were too fluid, too unnatural, and with each step, the air seemed to grow colder, the wind more intense. But that wasn't the worst part. No! The worst part came next. As the figure approached, he realized it wasn't alone. At first, there were only two, then three, then more, dozens of them, all emerging from the trees, their forms shifting in and out of the mist like ghosts. They moved in unison, their eyes fixed on the house, on the father, as if drawn to him by some unseen force. The father stumbled back, his heart racing, the door still hanging open. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of nightmare, some twisted dream. But the cold, the rain, the shadows, they were too real. He rushed his family, his mind racing. What was this? What were they? The mother stared at him, her eyes wide with fear. She hadn't seen them, not yet, but she knew. She felt it. The children huddled together, too scared to speak, their small bodies trembling. And then the whispers began, low at first, almost imperceptible, but growing steadily louder. They came from outside, from the storm, but they also seemed to come from within the house itself. The father looked around, panic rising in his chest. The walls creaked, the floorboards groaned. The house, once their refuge, now felt like a trap. But that's not the worst part. No, the worst part came when he realized the sound wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from inside the house. The father's eyes darted around the room. The mother clutched the children tighter, her breath shallow, her heart racing. And then they heard it. Footsteps, slow, heavy, coming from upstairs. He hadn't realized it before, but the door to the attic was ajar, swinging slightly in the wind, and from that dark, shadowy space above them, the sound of footsteps grew louder, descending slowly, one step at a time. He wanted to run, to grab his family and flee, but his legs wouldn't move. He felt rooted to the spot, trapped by his own fear. And then, in the silence between the footsteps, he heard something else. A voice, soft but unmistakable. "We've been waiting." It was a child's voice, his daughter's voice, but she was standing right next to him. The father looked down at his daughter, her face pale with fear. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't moved. But the voice, it was her voice. He knew it. But that's not the worst part. No! The worst part came when the daughter spoke, her voice trembling. "Daddy." I didn't say anything. His blood ran cold. The voice was still calling, still echoing from the attic, still using his daughter's voice. And yet, she was standing right there, silent, trembling. He didn't know what to believe, didn't know what was real anymore. All he knew was that something terrible was in the house with them. He had to act. He had to protect his family. But what could he do? What could any of them do? The storm outside raged on, the figures in the woods drawing nearer, their eyes gleaming in the dark. And inside, something was coming, something far worse than they had imagined. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He didn't know what was waiting for them in the attic, didn't know if they would survive the night, but he had to face it. He had no choice. And just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, when the fear threatened to consume him entirely, the footsteps stopped. The house fell silent, the rain outside a distant hum. He reached for the door, his hand trembling, his breath shallow. This was it. Whatever was waiting for them, whatever horror had been lurking in the shadows, it was behind this door. And as he pulled it open, as the hinges creaked and the darkness spilled out into the hallway, he knew this was only the beginning. As the father stood at the edge of the attic, the darkness seemed to stretch out forever, an endless void that swallowed the faint light from the hallway. His hand hovered over the door handle, the air thick with tension, with the weight of something unknown. Now, imagine you're standing in his place. The storm rages outside. Shadows dance in the corners of your vision, and something you can't explain is waiting in the attic. Would you open that door? Would you face whatever was lurking in the dark? Let me know, what would you do? The father took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. Whatever it was, it had already made its way inside. But as his hand closed around the door handle, he hesitated. The voice, his daughter's voice, it was calling to him again, softer this time, almost pleading. Please, come upstairs. His grip tightened on the handle, his mind racing. What if it was a trick? What if the voice wasn't really his daughter's? Could he risk it? Could he trust his own ears? What would you do? Would you rush in to protect your family? Or would you turn and run? With a final glance at his wife and children, he opened the door. Slowly, the old wood creaked, the hinges groaned, and as the darkness spilled out of the attic, the cold hit him like a wave. But nothing could have prepared him for what came next. And just as he stepped inside, a flicker of light illuminated the room. Brief, almost imperceptible, but in that moment he saw something. Something that shouldn't have been there. Tell me, would you keep going? Would you face whatever was hiding in the dark? Or would you turn back? Comment below. What would be your next move? He closed the door, his body trembling with fear. He didn't know what he saw, didn't know if it was real or if his mind was playing tricks on him. But he knew one thing. Whatever was up there was waiting, watching. The house fell silent once more. The rain continued to pour outside, but inside, the tension was unbearable. And then a loud crash echoed from upstairs. Something heavy, something that sounded like furniture being thrown across the room. The father froze. His wife gasped. The children whimpered. And in that moment, he realized the voice was no longer coming from the attic. It was closer now, much closer. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the darkened hallway. The house creaked under the weight of the storm, but there was something else. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming from the room right behind him. Let me ask you this, would you open that door? Would you face what's waiting on the other side? Share your thoughts in the comments. We want to know, What would you do? The father turned to face the door. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. The door in front of him slowly creaked open, and as the darkness inside spilled out into the hallway, he braced himself for the worst. But that's not the worst part. No. The worst part came when the father realized he wasn't alone anymore. He turned, his heart pounding in his chest, and his breath caught in his throat. The figure stood there, motionless, its eyes locked on his. He couldn't move. He couldn't scream. He could only watch as it took a step closer. Let us know in the comments, what do you think the father should do? How would you escape a nightmare like this? And don't forget to subscribe for more terrifying stories. You won't want to miss what happens next. Hours pass, but the storm outside showed no signs of stopping. Inside, the house had fallen into a suffocating silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old floorboards and the soft patter of rain against the windows. The father hadn't moved from his spot at the end of the hallway, his eyes fixed on the door that now stood wide open. He had heard the whispers, seen the figure, but the rest of the house had remained quiet, too quiet. His wife and children had retreated to the living room, huddled together, waiting for something to happen, something more. But the longer he stood there, the more it became clear. Whatever had called him to the attic was not finished. Something in the air had changed. It was subtle at first, like a distant shift in the wind, but as the minutes ticked by, the tension in the house began to grow again. A cold, creeping sensation, like being watched from the shadows. And then, just as he began to think it might all be over, the soft voice of his daughter came again. Closer this time. Much closer. Daddy, come here. He knew she couldn't be calling from upstairs. He knew. And yet, the voice was clear, coming from just beyond the door, deep within the darkened attic. A soft, beckoning plea. The father took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. Every instinct screamed for him to turn away, to leave the house and never look back. But he couldn't move. His feet were rooted to the floor, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. And then, without warning, the door to the attic slammed shut. The crash echoed through the house, shaking the walls, rattling the windows. The father stumbled backward, his breath caught in his throat, but when he turned to look, the hallway was empty. The voice was gone. The whispers ceased. Only the sound of the storm remained. Downstairs, his wife called out to him. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice trembling with fear. He didn't answer. He couldn't, because something had changed. The house was no longer the same. He could feel it, a shift in the atmosphere, a coldness creeping into every corner, every room. Something had been awakened, something that was never meant to be found. As the father descended the stairs, his steps slow and deliberate, he knew deep down that the house was no longer just a house. It was something else now, something much darker. He looked at his wife and children, but the words wouldn't come. How could he explain what had just happened? How could he warn them when he didn't even understand it himself? And then the whisper came again, this time from just behind him. "Daddy, please come upstairs." Some say the house still stands today, abandoned by those who once called it home. Others say the whispers never left, that on stormy nights, You can still hear them calling out from the attic, waiting for someone to come upstairs. So, what would you do? Would you dare answer the call? Or would you leave, never to return? Let us know in the comments. Would you have opened that door? What would you do if the voice called out to you? And don't forget, the next storm might just bring a new story. Subscribe and be ready for more tales of terror. But remember, some doors are better left unopened.